to 2 years if the intent is to cause alarm, distress or humiliation. It can also extend to 2 years if the purpose is to gain sexual gratification. And crucially, it can go to 2 years. There's an offence of threatening to share these materials that also carry a 2-year penalty.
That concludes oral questions for today. We now come to questions to the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. First question, Lord Collins of Highbury.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper and give the Foreign Secretary time to move.
My Lords, we set out our commitments on developing country debt in our International Development White Paper. The Treasury and FCDO regularly engage with international partners to address rising debt vulnerabilities in developing countries. The UK also coordinates with other official creditors to provide debt restructurings when needed, both at the Paris Club and the G20 Common Framework.
My Lords, after COVID, we had the Common Framework by the international community. Sadly, only 4 countries have applied, and certainly the situation is getting worse, not better in terms of debt. Does the Noble Lord accept that a huge step forward would be to agree with global partners on a workable definition of debt sustainability to provide countries in debt distress a more level playing field?
Well, I thank the Noble Lord for his question. We're very happy to accept the IMF definition of debt sustainability and use that as the baseline. We're very happy to look at other ideas, but I think with the IMF's role that makes sense. But we completely accept what lies behind his question. You've now got 58% of low-income countries that are either in debt distress or at risk of debt distress, so he raises a very important point. But I think the definition is done by the IMF.
My Lord.
Change is already hitting the poorest, the worst and the most, often in indebted countries. So though it's welcome that a loss and damage fund was agreed at the last COP, does he agree that what's been pledged so far, including, I'm afraid, by the United Kingdom, is totally inadequate? And so doesn't he agree that it's not only right to scale this up, but also in our self-interest as we seek to reduce conflict and migration that's likely to be caused by climate change, which is going to be much more costly?
Well, what we've done is doubled our commitments to climate finance, and I thought one of the successes of COP was actually that the climate finance funds are now very considerable, running into many billions. I would identify the problem more as particularly small countries, particularly island developing states, not being able to access the money because they don't have the expertise, the lawyers and the bankers and the officials and everything else. I think that's a problem which my department is trying to solve. And also, of course, in the area of debt itself, these climate resilient debt clauses, which we're now writing into debt, that give states a holiday from debt repayment if they suffer a climate disaster or some other unforeseen event. I think they can be a big part of the future as well.
My Lords, would the Foreign Secretary confirm that through China's Belt and Road programmes, developing nations are estimated to be indebted to China to the tune of more than $1 trillion? Does he share the view of Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee that it would be naive not to see how such punitive debt in countries like Sri Lanka, $47 billion in debt, half to China, how this can be used by China to buy support in the UN, to expand its military presence and for leverage in domestic and international institutions? My Lords, how are we countering this?
Well, I think one of the most important ways to counter this is by offering alternatives. So when countries are developing, there are other offers on the table, and that's why the expansion of British International Investment, BII, what used to be the Commonwealth Development Corporation, is so important. We're also countering it through the expansion of the multilateral development banks, where in our white paper we're demonstrating how you can expand their balance sheets and get them to lend more. But the Noble Lord makes a very good point, which is, if you look back 10, 15, 20 years when we were doing debt forgiveness programs to help these highly indebted countries, it was mostly Paris Club countries, it was France and Germany and Britain and America that were responsible for this debt. So if you wanted to write it off, you could. Now so much of the debt that's owed is from China, who don't believe in debt write-offs. We have to find other ways of delivering restructurings to help these countries that have got into trouble.
the debt of these developing countries. What's to stop them running up more debt in the future?
As ever, my noble friend makes a very good point. If you look back at the very successful programs there were, like the highly indebted Poor Countries Initiative, it did help them, but many of those countries have gone back into debt again. The situation isn't as bad as it was before. The debt-GDP ratios in these very indebted countries is something like 60%, whereas it did get to 100%. I would argue one of the best things we can do with these countries is actually help them to have better fiscal systems where they can raise their own taxes. And I know, noble lords, like a Rwanda update, we have been working with Rwanda since the 1990s, and we've actually helped them to increase their tax revenue tenfold. So their ratio of tax to GDP has doubled from 8% to 16%, the highest in the region. That's a better thing to do in many occasions than lending these countries money.
My Lords, a major reason for indebtedness of developing countries is that too many multinational corporations operating there actually dodge taxes by shifting profits to low and no tax jurisdictions. The IMF estimates that around $213 billion of taxes are lost each year. An earlier Prime Minister introduced the Finance Act 2016 and promised that companies would publish what is called a public form of country-by-country reporting, so that there is some visibility of the profits shifted by UK companies. But later governments never honoured that commitment. Could he have a word with the current leaders of the government and try to revive that commitment?
I will. I think the noble lord refers to what was agreed at the G8 in Northern Ireland in 2013, where a whole series of steps forward were made to make sure that companies weren't what's known as base erosion and profit shifting and not paying their taxes in countries where they should. I think, to be fair to the former Prime Minister, who's now the Foreign Secretary, we did make some progress. And also, I think the OECD would say they've made a lot of progress, but I'll certainly check up on the point he makes.
On the question of Sri Lanka, will my noble friend recognise, and I pay particular thanks to Her Majesty's government for the way that they offered, and through the IMF, and were very firm to the government of Sri Lanka what they should do, and that government responded, and that means the people of Sri Lanka now can move forward. And I believe that's as good a case history as you will find in recent times.
Well, but my noble friend's absolutely right that Sri Lanka is a country that is in debt distress. It has been working through a programme with the IMF. We do wish the new government in Sri Lanka well as they go through this and try and make sure they can build a brighter future for that country.
One of the things Andrew Mitchell said in introducing the White Paper was it can't be right that individuals in this country can borrow money at 4% or 5%, and in developing countries where they're addressing such huge issues, the cost of borrowing is so high. So can the noble lord tell us what discussions have his officials had regarding private creditors holding low-income country debt? And would he agree with me that a fairer system is needed between private creditors and countries in debt distress?
First of all, can I congratulate the noble lord on joining a club of which I'm a member, which is being personally sanctioned by Vladimir Putin. It's a badge I wear with honour, and I'm sure he will do. He will do too. It's you're in very good company. I can tell him. I follow these things very closely. He's absolutely right about the importance of making sure that we don't have so many what's known as private sector holdouts that are holding up the vital debt restructuring of countries that get into trouble. What we are trying to do here is use things like collective action clauses that work on bond issues, so you can't hold out against repayment, and also the majority voting provisions in new debt issuances, so you don't have the situation where, as I say, private sector lenders are stopping a country from getting the debt restructuring that they need.
I agree with the Foreign Secretary that increasing the capacity of government treasuries and their finance ministries to collect their own revenues, as well as trade facilitation, so that the trade ministries have greater capacity to trade out of poverty. I declare an interest. I co-chair the All-Party Group on Trade Out of Poverty. Does the Foreign Secretary believed that it was a mistake by some of his predecessors to cut UK support for exactly those processes. And since he's now passionate about this, and I agree with him, will he now restore that funding?
Well, what I would say to the noble lord is one of the great things that has been done while I was out of government is one of the government's best kept secrets, which is the developing countries trade system that we put in place that is actually more generous to the poorest countries in the world than what the EU does, more generous than what the US does. I think it's one of those generous systems in the world. So in terms of helping countries to trade out of poverty, I think this government's got an excellent record.
My Lords, further to the question from Lord Purvis of Tweed, surely one of the things we now need to do is really double down on the opportunities to sign bilateral trade treaties with different countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, because if they can increase their wealth through trade, then obviously they'll be able to pay off their debt in the future. So can you say something about those bilateral trade treaties that we're now able to sign post coming out of the EU?
I think the noble lord asked an important point, noble friend asked an important point, which is how we prioritise the trade deals we're trying to do. I think for the poorest countries, the DCTS, the Developing Country Trade System, is there. I think the priorities we've got in terms of trade deals, in terms of India and the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are very complex trade deals where a lot of work has to be done, so we're putting our priority there. So I think that is the right way round.
Second question, Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing under my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the best way to address the humanitarian situation is by ending the fighting as soon as possible. That is why I've repeatedly said an immediate pause in fighting is necessary. UK aid is saving children's lives. We're doing everything we can to get more aid into Gaza. We've trebled our aid commitment to the occupied Palestinian territories. This includes targeted support for children through our 5.75 million contribution to UNICEF, and children are also benefiting from life-saving food, shelter and health support that we're providing through partnerships with other UN agencies, through NGOs and the Red Crescent societies.
I thank the noble lord, but surely a pause in fighting is not enough. We need a permanent ceasefire now. But very specifically, I'm sure the noble lord is aware of the awful fate of 6-year-old Hind Rajab, calling for help in the midst of the bodies of her dead relatives, who appears to have died with 2 Red Crescent would-be rescuers. Has the government, or will the government, demand answers from the Israeli government about what happened to Hind and her family and the rescuers? And is the government challenging the Israeli government about the risks to hundreds of thousands of children in Rafah, now in the path of the Israeli offensive? Surely it's time to stop all arms shipments to Israel, as an Dutch court has demanded that state do, and implement targeted sanctions against members of the Israeli leadership, particularly those calling for new settlements in Gaza and on the West Bank.
The noble lady asked a number of questions there. First of all, the case she raises is completely tragic, and what is happening in Gaza is tragic. We want to see an end to this suffering, an end to this killing. Let me just make this point, that the pause we're calling for, we want to turn into a ceasefire by making sure the conditions are right for getting a stop in the fighting to mean a permanent ceasefire. The way you do that is by fulfilling a number of conditions. You've got to get, in our view, the Hamas leaders out of Gaza. Otherwise, any ceasefire won't last because the problem will still be there. You've got to dismantle the operation of terrorist attacks. You've got to have a new Palestinian Authority government in place. You've got to give the Palestinian people a political horizon to a better future and a two-state solution. And crucially, you've got to release all of the hostages and do that very quickly. She asked whether we challenge the Israel government over individual episodes. Yes, we absolutely do. I've done that personally with them over, for instance, a building that was bombed that had UK medics and other charities in, and we'll continue to do that as part of the very important process that we go through to judge whether they are in compliance with international humanitarian law.
Is my noble friend the Minister aware of any moves by Hamas to protect the children of Gaza, for instance by releasing all the hostages, as he just mentioned, or indeed stopping attacks on Israel and the leaders fleeing to the Gulf? Is he aware of any moves that? Because I agree with everything you said.
My noble friend makes a very good point. I mean, it's worth remembering that on the 7th of October, 29 children were killed by Hamas and 39 children were taken hostage, and they still remain hostages today. And of course, it's right that in this House we keep asking what else Israel should do, but we should also, at the very same time, say what Hamas should do, which is to lay down their weapons and stop right now. They could stop this fight immediately.
That the IDF have suggested that they are in no rush to enter into Rafah, and that they will delay possibly until after Ramadan, and that meanwhile the negotiations in Cairo can continue, and that gives a chance for Hamas to release the hostages and for the conflict to stop.
Well, that is absolutely right. I believe those discussions are underway, and it's a great pity that they didn't reach that conclusion the last time they were underway. And as I said, that is the best outcome we could seek, which is an immediate stop in the fighting. Let's hope that the stop is for as long as possible. I think that Israel was content to offer a month or 6 weeks in terms of a pause. Then we need the momentum to turn that pause into a permanent ceasefire without a return to the fighting. That should be our goal. But crucially, the pause is necessary to get the aid in and to get the hostages out.
To UNICEF. UNICEF have said today that 600,000 children are displaced within Rafah. For the
My Lords, there's plenty of time. We'll hear from the Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed, followed by the Noble Lord Green.
I'm grateful for the Chief Whip. My Lords, UNICEF has said today that 600,000 children are displaced within Rafah in Gaza. That is comparable to the entire under-12 population of Scotland being displaced to one postcode area. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that any belligerent in a conflict that advises children and civilians to relocate on the pretext of their safety, but relocate to an area where there is no shelter, where there is no water, where there is no medicine, and when there is no security guarantees, is a war crime?
Well, what I would say to the Noble Lord is what I said yesterday when I was in Scotland, which is, the people who are in Rafah on many occasions have already moved 3, 4 or 5 times, and it's not possible to move again. They can't go north because they'll be going back to homes that have been destroyed. They can't go south because that would involve going into Egypt, which none of us want to see and the Egyptians don't want to see, and that is why it's so important the Israelis stop and think before going ahead with any operations in Rafah.
My Lords, does the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, agree that the huge number of civilian casualties in Gaza is deeply damaging to the reputation of Israel itself? And will he therefore take action to promote a change of strategy by the Israelis, taking up the other measures that he's mentioned, but for so long as so many civilians, thousands of civilians are being killed, then that has to stop?
Our view right from the start is that while Israel has a right to defend itself, and the attacks on October the 7th were an appalling attack on Israel, and it's worth remembering it was the biggest pogrom since the Holocaust in terms of the loss of life of Jewish people. We shouldn't forget that. While that is a tragedy they had every right to respond to and to try and prevent happening again, they must obey international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, that involves not only what the IDF do in terms of the way they prosecute their actions in terms of this war, but it also means, as they are the occupying power in Gaza, that they have to make sure that humanitarian aid, that food and water and shelter are available to people in Gaza, because if they don't do that, that would be a breach of international humanitarian law as well.
My Lords, the Foreign Secretary is right. The priority has to be securing an immediate, I'd say an extended pause in fighting to ensure we can get aid in, the remaining hostages out, and create room for a long-term sustainable ceasefire followed by an even longer-term resolution. But there are currently almost 1.5 million displaced Palestinians in Rafah, and it's the main route for humanitarian aid. Any further Israeli offensive in Rafah will be catastrophic. Now, my Lords, the situation is getting more urgent by the hour. I know he's been working to establish a contact group of regional and international leaders who would influence both sides. Is he able to offer any progress on that group or their ability currently to try and influence events?
Well, what I can say to the noble lady is that at the Munich Security Conference on Friday, there will be a meeting of the key European countries that help to fund the occupied Palestinian territories and the key Arab states and Gulf states that are working to help support a future Palestinian Authority, and we very much hope the Secretary of State for the United States will be there as well. This isn't the yet formation of a contact group. There are a number of countries, particularly in the Arab world, that understandably are nervous about meeting in advance of a proper ceasefire and plan towards a cessation of hostilities. But I think we're on the way to getting this group, which I know she's long called for, up and running. And it's important because there are lots of things we need to start talking about now, whether that is what happens the day after a pause, whether it's about a reconstituted Palestinian Authority, whether it's about this question of how you offer a political horizon to people in the Palestinian territories, or indeed how we deal with Israel's very real security concerns of if there is a pause and then a ceasefire, how do you make sure the people responsible for October the 7th cannot remain in Gaza and the infrastructure of terror is taken down?
My Lords, alongside medical aid, thank you. My Lords, alongside medical aid on the ground, one practical step that the government could take with an immediate impact would be to support medical care to children injured in Gaza on a temporary basis in the United Kingdom. I know my noble friend and his department have been looking at this possibility, and I would be grateful if he could update us on progress.
Well, I want to thank my noble friend for that. We are looking at Project Pure Hope. We're looking very closely at this. Is it possible to take the people in greatest need and bring them to British hospitals, as we've done in the past? I think, I would say, the early work we've done is to say that there's much we can do in the region, and we should probably do that first. So helping in the field hospitals that have been established, helping to send medical teams to referral hospitals that are being used in the region, supporting organisations like Medical Aid for Palestinians. Now, if that leads to the identification of specific cases where actually they would be better off taking that long journey back to Britain and going to Great Ormond Street or elsewhere, then we certainly don't rule that out, and we'll continue to look at it.
Third question, Lord Walmsley.
Thank you. I beg leave to ask a question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, AUKUS is an unprecedented partnership that is central to delivering security and prosperity for the UK and our partners in the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. We're making significant progress to deliver nuclear-powered submarines for the UK and Australia, and we're deepening cooperation on cutting-edge military technologies. We're breaking down barriers to defence trade, and we're delivering benefits at home, securing £4 billion of contracts for British companies and generating thousands of jobs, including in Derby and, I'm pleased to say, Barrow-in-Furness.
I thank the noble lord for that answer. As he rightly says, this is a landmark security partnership that requires a sustained commitment from multiple governments over years, indeed decades. So what is the Foreign Secretary doing to ensure that the focus of his department and the whole government can remain on this despite the ongoing rolling crises in other areas? And in particular, how can he prioritise the diplomatic work which is needed to ensure that the US can make progress on ITAR reform that can enable the technological industrial cooperation that is necessary to deter our common adversary?
Well, what I would say is on how the government coordinates this at a time when there are many distractions, the National Security Council is playing a role at bringing together all the ways we can support Team Barrow, as it were, to make sure that there's support for education and for skills and for housing and for transport and all that's going to be needed to scale up this production effort as we go from 11,000 people employed building submarines to 17,000. On the specific issue of ITAR, which has been a troubling issue that British governments have had to deal with American governments for decades, I mean, it's essential that AUKUS partners can trade freely between each other in defence equipment. And I'm pleased to say we have made some real progress. I met Secretary Blinken in early December, and on the 22nd of December, President Biden signed the US National Defence Authorization Act, which enables license-free trade between the AUKUS countries, and we're working with the State Department on the technical details to make sure that really happens.
Are any other countries applying to join the AUKUS partnership, and are we thinking of applying to join the Quad, that's America, Japan, India and the United States. And are we going to attend, will the UK be attending the Perth conference on Indian Ocean security and defence, where all these issues tend to come together and will be discussed this summer?
On the last point, I think I'm right in saying that one of my ministerial colleagues will be attending the Perth conference because it is very important. As my noble friend will know, AUKUS has two pillars. There's the pillar one, which is about the nuclear-powered submarines, which that is Britain, Australia and America, and I don't think there'll be additional partners in that. But there is pillar two, which is looking at advanced military technology for the future. And there we are open to ideas of other countries, possibly Canada, people have mentioned, or Japan, who might want to join into Pillar 2 because that is going to be about defence equipment for the future. The point he makes about the Quad is very important. We would say this is complementary to that activity.
My Lords, when AUKUS was first announced, the suggestion, at least from the MOD, seemed to be that somehow the United Kingdom had just slipped into an agreement with Australia over the nuclear submarines. But clearly, as the Secretary of State has pointed out, there is also the wider aspect of AUKUS. But does His Majesty's government have a strategic approach to this? Are we simply waiting to see whether other countries, such as Canada, wish to join? Or are we actually planning what we want to do? Because similarly, we have a trilateral agreement with Japan and Italy over fighter jets. Are we just being ad hoc, or is there a real strategy here for our security?
I would say to the noble lady, this is a deeply strategic approach. I mean, first of all, it fits into a tilt to the Indo-Pacific, where you can see we've signed the Hiroshima Accords with Japan. We have a new status at ASEAN. We have very strong partnerships with India. And, of course, now we've got AUKUS, which is a defence stature that puts us in with Australia and America in a very strategic way. In terms of the partners, as I said, for Pillar 2, I think, yes, of course, we would welcome others to come, but in each occasion we'll have to ask what will they bring, and is it the right thing, and is it the right country, and is it the right fit? But the strategic move of AUKUS, I think, is incredibly powerful.
My Lords, nobody... Another member of the club of those on Mr. Putin's blacklist. While welcoming the AUKUS agreement, would the Minister accept that the handling with the French was pretty catastrophic, and that France is a major Indo-Pacific power, and that now, when perhaps those bruises have healed somewhat, there is time to work with the French as well in the Indo-Pacific area, where they have a great deal to contribute?
I think that my noble friend makes a good point, which is that ultimately Britain and France should work to cooperate as closely as we can, because we are similar-sized powers with similar-sized militaries and similar-sized global ambitions, and that's what the Lancaster House Agreement that he did so much to bring about was all about. I think what I would say to French partners now looking at this is what AUKUS does for UK capacity is make sure that we are going to replace the Astute submarines, which are incredibly high-tech and successful, with a new generation AUKUS submarine, and so the funding and the capacity is in place for that, so we're assuring our future. And I think that is actually good for France, because we can then work with them about talking about how they're going to secure their future for their submarine programme.
My Lords, nobody has yet mentioned China, so allow me to do so. Would my noble friend agree that it's very important that we should continue to talk with China and find as many areas and expand on as many areas of agreement as possible? But isn't it in all this discussion possible to focus too narrowly on the threat of China? Should we not be doing more to embrace the democracies in Asia, Japan, India, Malaysia, South Korea, who are already more populous than China, who are growing economically much faster than China, and who in a few years' time will be economically far more powerful than China is?
Well, I very much agree with my noble friend. I think you can do both those things. It is important that we have a relationship with China. There are many disagreements we have. They are an epoch-defining challenge, as the integrated review puts it, but where we can find areas to progress discussions, we should. But he's completely right to focus on the emerging democracies of the Far East. And that's why I think not just AUKUS, but the Hiroshima Accords, the ASEAN relationship, the ministerial connections we've got in Indonesia, Malaysia, and indeed Vietnam. I think I was the first Prime Minister ever, serving Prime Minister, to visit Vietnam, and I hope to get back there soon.
My Lords, does the
agreement is incredibly important and very, very exciting. And without it, we would not actually be able to develop and get the sufficient number of nuclear submarines to replace the Astute class, and for that reason it's very important. Could I ask the Foreign Secretary, though, the timescale looks very long. We should actually be pulling teams together now in terms of how we're going to design and build that submarine, because if we don't, we won't do it in time, and also, because the Australians will have the Virginia class, the Americans will probably start doing a design instead.
No, well, the Noble Lord is completely right that we have to get on with it, and that's why there is Team Barrow, to bring together the Town Council, BAE Systems and the government, and a lot of money is being put in, 25 million from the government, and I think a further 16 million of levelling up money to make sure we have the capacity, not just the defence capacity, but the physical capacity in the town and the people to do this. I would say I'm confident we can get this done. I mean, the Virginia-class submarines are being sold by the Americans to the Australians to help prevent them from having a gap. It's up to us to make sure we don't have a gap and that there's no break between our excellent Astute-class submarines, which I'm very proud most of them were built during my time in office, that there has no gap between those and the AUKUS submarines to follow.
It's been said by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee of another place that South Korea and Japan, I quote, should be invited to join AUKUS and the Technological Defence Cooperation Agreement, or Pillar 2 that he referred to in his initial reply. So this wasn't just waiting on events. They urged us to invite them to join AUKUS, and I wondered if he'll give that recommendation further consideration. And pursuing the point made by his noble friend a moment ago, Bloomberg have estimated that if there was a blockade of the Taiwan Straits, it would cost the world economy some $10 trillion. What above and beyond AUKUS are we doing to deter the Communist Party of China?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we're doing, more generally, is stressing the importance of the freedom of navigation. And that lies behind the action that we're taking in the Red Sea. And I'm going to be hopefully holding some discussions with Chinese counterparts in days to come, where I think we'll be asking them, given the importance of trade to China, that they should be as fully supportive of freedom of navigation as we are, because that matters wherever you are in the world, including the Taiwan Straits.
But were there no voices at the National Security Council that spoke to caution at all in respect of risk and affordability? In terms of affordability, I think that Team Barrow sounds quite expensive. Is this again going to be at the expense of the conventional programme of UK defence? And in terms of risk, is there not risk that there could be leakage of our own very small supply of very highly qualified people whose career paths they would rather follow in Fremantle than Barrow?
I don't believe that the concerns he has are right. I mean, the money going into Barrow is a drop in the ocean compared to the cost of one submarine. As he well knows, these things come out at about £1 billion each. What we need to make sure is that Barrow, which has incredible manufacturing expertise, is fit to do this extra work that's going to be required as they scale up to 17,000 jobs. Are we going to benefit as a country? I would say absolutely yes. I mean, Rolls-Royce in Derby are going to be providing the nuclear reactors for these submarines, not just for the ones that we use, but also the ones that Australia uses. So I would say this is good for our defence, it is good for our international relations, and it's good for our industrial base.
Fourth question, Lord Jackson of Peterborough.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, this government has always supported a two-state solution, and that remains the case. Clearly, recognising a Palestinian state at the right time is part of that policy. My noble friend asked about consulting our allies, and of course we discuss all issues relating to the conflict in Gaza and Israel-Palestine relations. But ultimately, I'm pleased to tell him that the UK has a sovereign and independent foreign policy set by a British Prime Minister and a British Foreign Secretary in the British Parliament.
I welcome that answer. Hamas is a genocidal terror group. For the benefit of the BBC, they're not militants. The Palestinian Authority has lost control of large cities in the West Bank to Iranian-backed terror groups, openly pays salaries to convicted terrorists, and is deeply corrupt and repressive. Palestinian statehood is, I trust, something all of us in this House wish to see. But does my noble friend share my very grave concerns that premature unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state now risks rewarding Hamas, playing into Iran's hands, and perhaps jeopardising the chances for a long-term, sustainable peace?
I absolutely understand where my noble friend is coming from. I would just say to him that of course it isn't rewarding Hamas. Hamas don't believe in a two-state solution. They believe in the destruction of Israel. And my point is that if you look at the whole point of a two-state solution is to create long-term sustainable peace. And I think the last 30 years have shown that we won't solve this problem without a solution that gives dignity and security to Palestinian people, as well as giving vital security to Israel. So I say this as a strong friend of Israel, that this is the right approach and we should pursue it.
After Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2000... I'm sorry, I apologize.
Thank you, my Lord. I welcome very strongly the continued emphasis by the Secretary of State on the two-state solution, and also his condemnation of the Hamas terrorist group and his call for the liberation of hostages, as was echoed in a statement this morning from the bishops. But it's not only in Gaza that we're seeing tragedy, we're seeing it also in the West Bank, where it is almost forgotten that very large numbers of Palestinians have been killed by people who live in illegal settlements. One of the countries most affected by that is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And my question is, what support is His Majesty's government giving to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, given its vulnerability and its significant responsibility as guardian of the holy places, which, if they come under significant pressure, would widen the conflict appallingly and dramatically? And second, in the practicalities for them of preparing for or aiding a two-state solution, where the flow of refugees towards them, and they've taken something like half their population refugees, would be a very threatening process for their destabilisation.
Well, can I thank the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, for his question. First of all, he's absolutely right to say we should focus on what's happening in the West Bank as well as Gaza. And it is a chilling statistic that since the 7th of October, 96 Palestinian children have been killed in the West Bank. There have been a series of very worrying developments and disturbances. And that's why the government is focused on this. And actually only yesterday, we for the first time announced some sanctions against violent settlers who were carrying out criminal acts in the West Bank. He rightly asked about what we're doing to help Jordan. I mean, first of all, in terms of Jordan's incredible work they do in looking after refugees, we have given a huge amount of aid and assistance to help them with the job that they have done. But I think the crucial thing, as he says, is to help work with the Jordanians, as we are, towards the two-state solution in which they can play a very big part. And a crucial thing that needs to be sorted out is how you move from the current Palestinian Authority that we have, that has a number of issues and difficulties, to a new technocratic government that would work across the Palestinian territories. And I think the Jordanians can play a big role in helping to bring that about.
200 land, my lords, 200 land-based conflicts in the world, 500,000 dead in Syria, the world's biggest humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, millions slaughtered in Africa. Yet the only conflict people in the UK seem to want to protest about is Israel defending itself against the racist, genocidal Islamists of Hamas. What does the Foreign Secretary think explains this irrational obsession with the world's only Jewish state?
Well, I think the Noble Lord makes a very important point, which is if you look across the world and you ask yourself the question, where's the biggest refugee crisis? It's not in Israel or in the Palestinian territories. It is either in Sudan, where about 9 million people have moved into Egypt, or you could argue that is in Myanmar, where Bangladeshis are looking after millions of Rohingyas in very difficult conditions. So I think it is important we try and keep a focus on what is happening around the world and looking at the numbers. But that said, I think the reason people are focused on Gaza right now is because of the level of death and destruction, and people want to bring that to an end, as do I, which is why we've made this proposal for the immediate pause, moving to the ceasefire, with the 5 conditions we need to put in place to help to bring that about and work towards a political solution.
My Lords, after Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, Hamas was elected to power. And having been elected to power, it proceeded to terrorise and then murder its political opponents. Hamas remains very popular in Gaza, and it remains very popular in the West Bank. So my question to the Foreign Secretary is, how can we prevent an independent Palestinian state from being governed by Hamas, maintaining its policy of seeking to attack Israel and to murder, rape and abduct as many Israeli citizens as possible?
The Noble Lord asked an extremely good question. I think the point I would make is we've got to try and help separate the Palestinian people from Hamas. And one of the best ways of doing that, apart from making sure that, as I've said, our conditions should include the Hamas leadership leaving Gaza, the dismantling of the terrorist infrastructure, the other way of doing that is to offer Palestinian people, not Hamas, because they're not interested in a two-state solution, but offering the Palestinian people a route to better governance with a reformed Palestinian Authority and the long-term horizon of a two-state solution to give them the dignity and security that they crave and that would help to bring about peace in the region.
My Lord.
Made the original statement, he was very clear that we need to show irreversible progress towards a two-state solution, something that we, both sides of this House, have talked about for a long time. Now, my right honourable friend David Lammy welcomed the Noble Lord's comments, arguing that recognition should not wait for the final status agreement, but should be part of efforts to achieve one. Now, the Noble Lord, I asked the Noble Lord, Lord Ahmed, the day after his comments, what were we doing to translate your desire into discussions with our allies, particularly at the United Nations, and how do we give that hope a sense of reality?
Well, what Lord Ahmed and I are doing, and we are virtually joined at the hip when we're not travelling separately to the region, is going to talk to all of the partners in the region about how you work towards making this a reality. And the point I would make to him is recognition is obviously part of a two-state solution. And it's something that should help with the momentum. The point I've been making is that it should not be the first thing that we do. I think that would take the pressure off the Palestinians to reform and the things that need to happen in the Palestinian Authority. But just because it doesn't happen at the beginning doesn't mean it has to wait right till the end. And I think one of the things that is beginning to change, which I think is hopeful, is the American posture up to now has been that recognition can only come when Israel and Palestine agree on the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, if you do that, you do effectively give Israel a veto over a Palestinian state, and I think that's the opposite of creating the sort of unstoppable momentum towards a two-state solution that we all want to see.
Regardless of whether or not there is to be
He's had you already.
No, he hasn't.
Can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's comments with regards to the flexibility of recognising the State of Palestine before that there is a full agreement with the State of Israel? I declare that I will be travelling to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and Ramallah from tomorrow night. What message can I take to those that I'll be meeting from the Foreign Secretary that he has persuaded like-minded countries and allies of us so that he can share with these benches who have a long-standing view that recognising the State of Palestine before any long-term agreement is the best platform in order to get an agreement with Israel?
Well, what I can say to the Noble Lord is that after I made my statement, which is absolutely in line with our long-standing policy that recognition should come when it gives the maximum impetus and input to a solution, After that, the Americans announced that they were re-examining their policy and looking at options to see if they could examine how best recognition could play a part in bringing a two-state solution about.
Well, that concludes Secretary of State's questions for today.
Business of the House, the Lord Privy Seal.
My Lords, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Questions on the statement made in the House of Commons on Thursday, the 8th of February, on protest measures.
Anyway, there we go. My Lords, can I thank the Noble Lord for this repeat of the Government's statement on protest measures from last week. It is important to start such a statement by thanking the police for all the work they are doing to maintain public order across the country. We know that many officers are having to give up rest days to police protests, and these demands are growing. So can the Minister start by outlining how resources are being allocated to support this demand and what its impact has been on neighbourhood policing? My Lords, protest is a fundamental freedom in a democracy, and that right must be protected. If that freedom is abused and used to intimidate, harass or harm others, then safeguards are clearly needed. This is yet another suite of measures to tackle issues arising at protests. Can the Minister confirm that all of these additional measures have been requested by the police across the UK as well as in London, and that the new measures will be included within the Criminal Justice Bill to allow proper scrutiny of the accompanying guidelines? On the issue of face coverings and the power of arrest for those seeking to conceal their identity, is this an automatic offence decided by an individual officer or triggered by a set of circumstances to be then authorised by a senior officer? We all understand where there is legitimate concern about the use of face coverings to conceal identity. But what about Chinese dissidents protesting outside the Chinese embassy, or Iranian dissidents demonstrating outside the Iranian embassy? Will they still be able to cover their faces, which they may well wish to do so, to protect families at home from intimidation or worse? We must never allow our proud tradition of giving safe haven to dissidents opposing oppressive regimes. On the measures relating to flares and fireworks, we support these. They have been used to fuel public disorder and indeed to intimidate the police. Can the Noble Lord say anything about how this will be enforced in protests, sometimes involving thousands? And on our war memorials, they rightly hold a special place in the collective affection and respect of our own nation. They remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the very freedoms that a very small number of people would seek to desecrate. This sparked understandable outrage across the country, including personally for me, as my uncle, who I am named after, who was killed on D-Day. His name is proudly remembered on a war memorial close to his home village of Cheldon in the Devon town of Chumley, in the former constituency of the Noble Lord, Lord Swire, or nearby, anyway. To think that or other war memorials were under threat or even defaced is unthinkable. Can the Noble Lord outline how it's expected that new measure included in the forthcoming bill will work in practice. It did, however, also raise the issue of the definition of hateful extremism. This is being looked at by the government and work is ongoing. And I wonder whether the Noble Lord could update us on what progress is being made by the government with respect to this and when we can expect any statement by the government. My Lords, of course, the police need the necessary laws to police protest and, importantly, also have the confidence to use them. The Noble Minister in the other place raised the issue of the prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Are other groups under consideration for prescription, and has the government made any assessment of their involvement in any of the protests that we have seen, and what, if any, action the government seeking to take? But above all, my Lords, in our proud democracy, it is the right to peacefully protest, and that is a fundamental freedom in our country of which we are all proud. It must not be abused, but it must not be curbed unnecessarily either, and the right balance must be struck between safeguarding that right to protest and the important duty to safeguard the public.
My Lords, I appreciate the government